Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Dan Baptiste, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. Welcome to Content Disrupted. Joining us today is Conor Grennan, Chief AI Architect at NYU Stern School of Business and founder of AI Mindset, a training and consulting firm helping leaders embrace generative AI for growth and innovation. Conor has worked with many top organizations like McKinsey, NASA, JP Morgan, and more, helping them better understand and strategically leverage AI. Conor is also a New York Times bestselling author, speaker, and has nearly 100,000 followers. Did you know that? On LinkedIn, tracking his AI insights. I highly recommend following him. He's one of my top information sources on AI, which is why I'm so excited to talk to Conor today. Conor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Conor, before we dig in, I want to touch on your background. So, you've had quite the journey as I kind of dug into your background and your bio. So, best-selling author, humanitarian, dean of students at NYU, and now chief AI architect at NYU and CEO founder of the AI Mindset. So, looking at your trajectory, being a leading voice in AI seems like an outlier. So, how'd you get into the AI space, and kind of what caused you to go all in?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I want that to be sort of like an encouraging story. I feel like sometimes some of these stories just feel like, oh, and then I just tried this and it worked. But it was totally accidental. The funny thing is I don't have a tech background at all. My background is in academia and other things like that. And so I fell into this totally accidentally. And I think this is probably relevant to our conversation too, because and you and I were just talking offline there for a minute about how early you all were in on this game, and for me, I was not. When ChatGPT came out, I had no background in AI whatsoever, but started messing around with it because my wife, who's at McKinsey, was in this world a little bit, messed around with it a little bit, and at the time, I was dean of students for NYU Stern for the graduate program for 10 years or 9 years or something at that point. And as soon as I dove in, like a lot of people probably was like, oh my gosh, like this is going to be revolutionary and it's going to change the way we do everything. And so immediately I kind of called my boss at the dean of the school and just said, hey, we got to do something like right now. And he's like, I agree. What should we do you think? And I was like, well, let me just like start something, who cares? And so went down this path of just trying to create a framework around it just to teach people. And the funny thing about it to me anyway was that I sort of thought, well, I don't have any technical background, so I'm going to be at a huge disadvantage, but let me just be open about that. And so I started learning more about machine learning and AI and everything else, but then very quickly realized I'm not using any of this new information I'm learning in the traditional sense to get better at generative AI like ChatGPT. It's not, it doesn't seem relevant to me at all, very strangely. And that kind of led me down this path of realizing like, oh, this is very, very different than anything else we've learned, where it doesn't kind of hold to this typical sort of learning curve of learning a new technology or something like that. And that ended up changing how I taught it to our students and everything else, and to our administrators and faculty and things. And then that was sort of led into me working with other companies because I was trying to just get use cases from other companies saying, hey, how are you guys using this? And finding very quickly that people weren't really using it in early 2023. And then I kind of thought, well, any day now, the switch is going to flip and everybody's going to start using it all the time. And that just didn't really happen. And that led into a whole new idea of like, well, it turns out to be more of an adoption challenge rather than a technical challenge. And so point being, I found out early on, I think like, oh, this is much more behavioral. It's not actually a technology that I need to learn. And thus I didn't really need a background in it. And that was flabbergasting to me. So anyway, that started my whole kind of journey into this totally accidental.
I think that's really important. And I want to dig in there certainly, because I think a lot of folks today are overwhelmed by the sort of tech knowledge gap that you experience, right? It's like, oh my God, like how can I possibly master AI? But it's not about that, right? It's how do I understand how this changes my day to day? And I think, if we go to your firm that you created, the AI Mindset, arguably that the mindset part is more important than the AI part, if I understand that right. So, when you're thinking about organizations and frameworks, like what are some of the aspects of a healthy AI mindset and what's important that for organizations to put in place?
Yeah, and it's funny because I tend to not be a big mindset guy. I mean, I'm jealous of the mindset people who are like, "Oh, got to be mindful and mindfulness and meditation." It's just not it's like not me. Again, I'm super jealous of folks that where that really resonates for. But it's well said that the mindset is more important than the AI part. I think that the number one thing I discovered, and it's funny how long it took me to figure this out, is that you don't have to have any kind of technical background. And I don't mean that in the way where people say like, "Oh, you too can get fit in just 6 weeks." Like you know what I mean? Like cuz like, yeah, man, I know, but look at me, right? Like I'm not going to be that dude, right? So but in this case, it really is like that. You don't have to be sort of like a digital native or be better at this stuff or anything like that. All you actually have to do is decide you're just gonna do it. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's usually an intimidating idea, right? It's sort of like, well, here we are, new year, new you. Like all you have to do is just like every day you're gonna just, walk for 30 minutes. And that works for the first week of January. And then we sort of fall off. So typically a behavioral change is, I think, really intimidating because it's going against what you naturally do. Like you have your behaviors for a reason. And in this case, I think it's a little bit different because once you sort of dive in and realize like, oh, it's I don't actually need to know anything. I just have to use it. Now I never like just leave people with like, just try it because that never works. You have to give people some kind of framework around that. But the cool thing about this is that unlike something like getting in shape or exercising or something like that, I find very, very painful and it's not something I actually want to do any day, let alone every day, is this notion that once you start using these kinds of tools like ChatGPT, especially regularly, your day actually gets easier and more fun. And so there is a hurdle to get over. But once you get over that hurdle, you're like, oh my gosh, where has this been all my life, sort of thing. So I think it's accurate to sort of say that this is more of a mindset. But I also think that people who are very good at this leave people with this sense of like, just try it. It's like like, yeah, like just eat less and exercise. Like, yeah, man, we know, right? But it's not that simple. So that's where I think you're right. Is that the mindset really is the hard part in a way because it feels like, well, what does that mean? But it's also the easy part in that you don't have to like learn anything or anything like that.
Yeah, it's almost overwhelming, right? So you look at AI and it doesn't just finish your course, which is awesome. If anyone, we'll put a link in the show notes here. But I think one of the points you made was interesting, and I hadn't really considered it, which is it doesn't really replace anything. It's not like, oh yeah, like use AI instead of this. It almost, starts to change how you move through the day in ways that start to warp your brain a little bit, right? You're like, oh, like it's not like I can get incrementally better at this one thing because I introduced AI. It's like, hey, maybe I should change how I do that one thing. And then you keep doing that over and over again, and it feels overwhelming and it feels expansive, right? So I think, the idea of introducing it in ways to start understanding how it can work and have that feedback loop is really interesting. To that point, when you're thinking of mindset, and I don't know if I want to keep going back to that word, but what do you think is holding us back? Right? Is it just entrenchment in our day to day in trying to use it in a more incremental versus an expansive way? Like, what do you think is the barrier to actually, flipping the switch on this thing?
Yeah, I think the barrier is to your point that when we say it doesn't replace anything, the challenge around that is much bigger than we think, right? In other words, it's this brand new technology, and we're like, okay, well, usually with technology, it's replacing something, right? Like the light bulb replaces the candle, and Excel replaced a pencil and paper, sort of doing calculations and all that kind of stuff, right? So things tend to replace other things, and that's easy for our brains to understand because it's like, well, I was using this. Well, now let me learn how to do this. And it's a little trickier learning Excel than, but it's ultimately going to be worth it because it's going to make your life way easier, all that kind of stuff. So the problem with ChatGPT is that it seems to follow that model of, well, now we have this, And we used to use this, but now we use this. But that's actually not the case with ChatGPT because it's so expansive. The analogy I use a lot is, like electricity or something. Like, well, what does electricity replace? Like, you could start naming all the things that electricity replace, but it would take you forever because it's not like you use electricity like we're using electricity like right now, but not thinking about it. Or we use electricity to email, or we use electricity to get from New York to Denver or something. The problem isn't the technology and how we use it. The problem is how we work. And so the point about mindset. So I work with organizations a lot, and you mentioned the digital course partially because I was just trying to think like, how do we get everything into, how do we change how people think? And the big takeaway from the digital course, I think, if you want to save yourself, time and money, is just forget about AI and forget about tech altogether and start instead with just what do you do? So again, the analogy with electricity is important because it's, nobody's waking up in the morning and thinking like, oh, how am I going to use electricity to make my day better today? Right? You could, but you'd be a lunatic, first of all. Second of all, it would just be overwhelming because really, like, you wake up, your alarm probably wakes you up, and then you probably check something on your phone, like that's electricity, and you probably maybe turn on the light if it's winter, that's electricity, and then you're probably warm, so you don't have to put on like fur, you know what I mean, like fur pelts, because like your house is through electricity somehow heating, you know what I mean, like this. It's just your house was probably built using a lot of electricity, and then you make coffee, that's electricity. Point being that you're not thinking about electricity. You're thinking about just like, well, what do I need to do? It's like, well, I need to wake up and I need to start my day, and I probably need coffee, and I need to take a hot shower, and I need to, and it's sort of the same with AI, right? With generative AI, especially, is that instead of thinking, well, what are some good use cases for generative AI? It's just talk to me about your day. Do you know what I mean? Like, what do you do during your day? And then you just end up sort of systematically applying that. Now, I say that, but that's again a little bit of the just practice, just eat less and exercise. That's not really helpful. So the course that I built into the way I work with large enterprises is, look, here's a framework by which you can start thinking about this and start doing it systematically. Because to your point, it's, in a way, it's very, very easy. And then I keep coming back to the exercise one because I think it's relevant. You have a treadmill. It's very easy to get on the treadmill. There's nothing you have to learn, but it's also very hard. And so you need sort of a system by which to do that. This is way, way easier than getting on a treadmill, in my opinion, anyway. And so we have to think about it in a new way. That's the mindset thing. And that's where you start to need frameworks and ways of thinking about it and ways of switching things out in your brain, because your brain does not know what it is doing with this. It doesn't understand the concept of what this thing is. And it just needs a different way of thinking. It's tricky.
Yeah, so part of it is understanding, and part of it is kind of wrapping your brain around like the job to be done and almost simplifying it, right? You talk to a lot of leaders and organizations, and obviously changing an individual's behavior is relatively easier than trying to change like a large enterprise, right? Um, when you think of leaders, how do they operate in this environment? I think of this analogy. You've sparked analogies in me because I think it's a nice way to convey things. But when you're sitting on an airplane and they say secure your mask before you help others, like do you find from a leadership standpoint, it's really important to understand some of the fundamentals and wrap your head around this before you can walk into organizations? Like, is it imperative for leaders to really understand the opportunity and how it works, or should they offload this responsibility to people and teams within their organizations?
You know, that's a really interesting way to ask the question, because I think you're sort of answering it in a way with the question, which makes my life a little bit easier. But like, because it's both in a way, right? And I don't mean to sort of say like it's both. You got to do both. I don't mean that, but there's two things. So when sometimes I will hear, listen, this isn't just the role of leadership, like because it's so, and I don't like the word democratized, but I don't know how else to say it. Since everybody has equal access to this tool in a certain sense, the ideas can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be like this, the cascading of knowledge from the top down to the bottom, as usually happens with corporations. Like the new person comes in and learns from the person above that, et cetera, et cetera. So in this sense, anybody can be good at it. And so your ideas should come from anywhere. So that's the argument against, well, leadership really has to lead this process, right? And that is true. There's also a huge problem with that. And it goes to the how you started off the question, which is like, well, how should, putting your oxygen mask on first, like how should leaders sort of structure this? Because change in an individual is way easier than change in an organization. So I'll just let me tell you what I've done in the past that went wrong that made me realize the punchline of leaders have to understand this first, not before everybody else, but if they don't understand it, things go radically off the rails. So what happened was I would get called into like a big healthcare organization or something, and they would say, "Hey, can you teach our digital marketing team of 200 people or whatever it is how to use this?" And so I was like, "Sure." So I would do that, but something problematic would happen. The thing that went right was that it got everybody really excited because the way I teach is sort of getting people not just enthusiastic and excited about it, but also giving them a framework to think differently, all that kind of stuff. So they would do that and would accomplish the mission, which was it got, I don't know, everybody leveled up, but it got, everybody who was sort of, listening and excited leveled up. And that was great. So in a way, I kind of walked away being like, that was awesome. I did my job, all that kind of stuff. But the thing that went wrong was that because we didn't really have leadership in the room, those, let's call it 200 people, all really radically changed how they went about their day, right? But what does that mean? Well, it means either they were able to do a lot more work, just one person, because generative AI allows you to really expand what you're able to do in a workday, or it allowed people to kind of turn their 8-hour day into like a 6-hour day and essentially produce the same amount of work in 6 hours instead of 8 hours. And then a lot of this world, and I'll just stick with America because that's what I know best, you know, they're not looking to add extra hours or extra work, right? They want to come to work and they want to go home, right? And that's totally understandable. So, but what does that mean for the company? Well, this company that actually paid me to come in and do all this, it made their workers very happy or this team very happy. But did it actually hit revenue? I'm like, I don't think so, right? And why? Because they either turned their 8-hour day into a 6-hour day, or they did a lot more productivity, which what that ended up doing was really skewing talent evaluation, right? So all of a sudden, this person who wasn't nearly as talented as the marketer who had been there for 15 years and really understood the fundamentals, but they used this tool to look like a superhero. And all of a sudden they were like, oh my gosh, like we got to elevate Dan. Like Dan is incredible at this. Like who knew, right? But what happens is Dan is just using generative AI, whereas their more seasoned colleagues and probably more knowledgeable colleagues were much better at this. Dan was whipping past them. So now I say I won't do an engagement with an organization unless senior leadership is in the room. And ideally, I start with senior leadership. Sometimes I even start with the board, but really senior leadership. And so why is that? It's not because senior leadership has to know it and understand it. It's because of your sort of the oxygen mask analogy, right? It's because senior leadership, first of all, has to understand when they say, hey, we're all going to get fluent in generative AI. What does that mean? Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, they have to understand like what it looks like in their own workday. They have to understand, oh, well, it's so expensive that this is what it would look like in HR. This is what it looked like in legal. This is what it looks like in operations. This is what it looks like in sales. They have to understand how completely agnostic this technology is in that it can transform everybody across the department. And also all those department heads, essentially, sort of like the line managers, have to understand like, oh, I'm in HR. This is what it's going to look like in HR. Oh, I'm in sales. This is what it's going to look like. So that's number one. Number two is the talent evaluation problem, right? It's that unless they understand what this does, talent evaluation is going to get totally screwed up. Like they're not going to understand like, oh, this is what this looks like for individuals on this thing. And I think the third thing is really that they're not setting new benchmarks for their teams. They have to say, oh, now that I know what this can do, our new expectation for somebody on our sales team is not, I'm going to butcher this idea, but like it's not, instead of it used to be, it was being able to reach out to 20 people a day. Now it's being able to reach out to 40 people a day and cut down on this task. Or in the research department now, instead of spending 4 hours a day researching and another 4 hours a day, I work with legal a lot, so that's big on this one. Now it's an hour and a half of researching a day and then processing that. Anyway, I say all that to say that if you're not setting benchmarks at the leadership level, you're really screwing yourself because you won't understand what your organization is actually doing.
To that point, I think there's interest if you can start building almost like a new structure to test and learn as an organization versus me creating a Dan bot that makes me like incredibly productive, and then I want to hide that so I can have superpowers and work a 2-hour day and whip past everybody. But to that point, is there danger if you don't have a framework and AI is deployed individually across organizations? Because there's almost this concept that's at odds with each other of like, we have to test and learn, we have to deploy this. But if you're JP Morgan and your employees are testing and learning with AI, that seems really dangerous. Like, how do you rectify kind of those two concepts?
Yeah, it's really hard. And so it's funny because that approach is absolutely the right approach, right? Which is, hey, we have to be careful. Like, we have to, because this isn't just a tool like Excel that lives locally on your laptop. Like, this is something that is connected to the internet, is learning from people who are, using it, all that kind of stuff. So if you're at JP Morgan, you have to be extremely cautious about what you're uploading and everything like that. So we can't just be like, hey guys, here's this new tool. Let's all play with fire here. So two things happen there. Number one is that it really slows down organizations because they're like, well, look, just shut it off. Don't let anybody use it. And that was the story of 2023 for sure. The story of 2024 is a little more evolved in terms of, hey, listen, like these are really important tools and we have to sort of do it, but we have to do it cautiously and all that kind of stuff. So the challenge, I think, around that is really going to be first helping people understand what they are using and how this tool works, and also creating guidelines around this and all that sort of stuff. But most importantly, fundamentally educating people on how this works and what it is and everything else. And once people understand that, then you're absolutely right. They have to sort of like form guidelines around that. And it's almost a separate conversation, but it's absolutely critical to have that conversation.
I think part of the issue here is who's responsible for this change, who ultimately has ownership over it. So a lot of times you have organizations that are, kind of parking that responsibility in areas of the business, but from what you're describing about AI, it's agnostic, right? It touches everything. It's not truly AI. It's a little behavioral. So like, when you're seeing organizations that are really productive and healthy, where does ownership live in trying to drive that forward?
You know, it's a great question because there's not an easy answer to it. And I think that with so many digital transformations, it has to live somewhere. And the problem with AI is that it sort of has to live everywhere to a certain extent. And so when I'm talking to leadership at organizations and things like that, the hard truth is that it has to span departments. And so what I say is, like, if it has to live anywhere, I think, and this is a little bit of a controversial take on this, like, I think it has to live in HR almost, because HR is the one department in an organization that really understands how talent is upskilled, right? And so everybody has to do that. That's the baseline. However, there's another element to this, which is, well, what about where guidelines live and like what we're allowed to use and how we're allowed to use it and all that kind of stuff. That has to probably live in your tech department to a certain extent, and probably maybe legal to a certain extent or something like that. But in every organization, that's going to be slightly different. So you'll have to have some kind of gatekeeper around like use cases and things like that. And like, can we use this or can we use that? But that's where like probably some kind of AI council has to come in. The problem is it's so tempting to have it all live in IT or tech or something like that. And that tends to be a terrible mistake. And that's because IT and tech tends to work in a certain way. And that's usually very different than how your talent department works. Your talent department is all about empowering people and all that kind of stuff. And your tech department is also about empowering people for sure. But tech and legal has this other greater responsibility, which is like, well, what's safe? What are we allowed to do? All that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit of a dance, but unfortunately, I think that the problem around guardrails is that people have to work together and across departments. It's just not always easy. It's not always easy. So what I would say is that you have to have a set of principles around what do we upload and what do we don't? What do we not upload? Now, the good news is that for a lot of places like, software and in regulated industries and things like that, you already have that. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't really much different from that. I mean, like, you're not, when you have certain tools or who you share, documents with, or especially like, in insurance, which I work a lot with insurance, or financial services, which I work a lot with, you already have guardrails and guidelines around, hey, share this, don't share this. So we'll actually be building off that, which is good. So one of the things that when people are worried about, like, well, what can we upload and what we can, I always sort of say, like, well, just start with the basics. I mean, what are you allowed to share now? I mean, like, if you're in a regulated industry, there are certain things where you're just legally not allowed to share things because you're not allowed to share it with a third party or something like that. This is ChatGPT or something like that, is a third party. So you're not allowed to share that because it's a legal issue. So just like you're just going to be expanding those. And the bigger challenge is, well, what if everybody has access to it? It's like everybody has access to a lot of things. Do you know what I mean? Like, but and you trust them on that. You can trust them on this too, but you have to have those kind of like and make them as simple as possible. Sort of like, hey, here's the 5 big guardrails. Like if it involves this, then you can't. If it involves this, but if it's just marketing copy, if it's just this, if it's just this, then yes. So you kind of start with the broad and then get more and more granular. But especially if you're working on, but so marketing departments have a lot less to worry about. They just it's just not much to worry about on that. You know, like pretty much anything you can pretty much upload. It's when you get into these harder things of like, well, we're not allowed to share these with third parties and things like that. Well, you start with what you have now and then just start adapting it to AI. But it's hard. It gets so specific to the organization. But as long as you have that same kind of going back to your idea about like, as long as you have this mindset of like, this isn't that different, it's more like, what would you share with outsiders, things like that. That's where I would probably start that process.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. The pattern here is empowering people, and I think the big thing when folks started playing around with ChatGPT in particular, because it opened up and anybody could use it through a web browser. You're like, oh my god, like this can replace. Like if you're a leader, you're like, I could replace X amount of people, and that's not necessarily the case, right? At least not today. But starting to think differently of like, how do I empower people? How do I change behavior? And as you before you said HR in my head, I'm like, oh, he's going to say HR because this is, we keep going back to a talent question. Like, how do we upskill organizations and how do we get folks more productive and how do we get them to learn and behave differently and then start reimagining how they work through their day to day. And the thing that strikes me about this moment is and we've kind of called out expansive thinking a couple times, is it really requires a measure of creativity within some guardrails, right? So we have to say like, okay, this isn't like, oh, can I do this one thing better and faster? It's more like, okay, how do I reimagine, how we move through our day? So having that behavior kind of living with the people who shape behavior makes a whole lot of sense, because you have other departments that are more focused on policing, right? Like, oh, you can't use this, you can't do that, you can't. And if you park AI in the kind of you can't bucket, you're going to really undersell the upside. And I don't know if you agree or want to add to that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that the biggest danger here is not using it at all, just because it can become to a certain extent an existential threat to the existence of your organization. I mean, if every other company had sort of like discovered, the internet and e-commerce and things like that, and you're like, no way. You know what I mean? Who knows? Who can trust credit cards online, right? You can understand where people would come at that, right? But boy, oh boy, like you're really, I mean, like, and we can, you can sort of like go through the case studies over time where Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix and all that. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of things where like, no, but we have a model that works. You do. You have a model that works today, in late 2024, early 2025. Like you do have a model that works. It's probably not going anywhere. I mean, it's the huge problem with like Google search, right? I mean, Google search, like if Google search didn't change at all, they'd still be fine. They'd be making billions and billions and billions of dollars. The problem is that they see that this is not how it's always going to be. You know what I mean? Like, and those are the companies that tend to not just survive, but do very, very well. And I think that, when we're talking about like where upskilling lives, it does have to live in this, like where in your organization does learning happen? Like it's much more of a cultural issue than it is well, let's give everybody this new thing. I mean, I've seen over and over again with, Microsoft Copilot, things like this, these tools that can be very useful, but people are treating it as if it's just like, well, it's just a new upgrade to Word or something like that, just giving it to people. And then over and over again, what you see is, well, people aren't really using it. It's like, yeah, why would they? Because they're not, it's sort of like, it's like climate change or something. It's like, you want to try to plan 30 years in advance? Like, good luck, man. You know what I mean? Like it's because like anytime people have to change now for a future that they see, that's very hard. So instead you have to approach it. I believe you have to approach it in a radically different way. So when I'm talking with leadership, it's like, leadership has to do a few things right up front. They don't have to, but what I advise them to do is a few things right up front is, first of all, be very vulnerable in like how they are trying to figure this thing out too, the use cases that they're using, how they have figured it out, how they're working with their kids, and how they're trying to be like a better spouse and all that kind of stuff. Like, so it's not just at work. This is sort of something that is going to change how we do everything. Number one. Number two, you have to talk to your organization about, AI is not here to replace you. Like if we're just having AI replace you, we're probably doing it wrong. And I what I tell organizations too is that like if an organization is look at just as is just looking at cutting costs, but not growth, but really just cutting costs, then AI is amazing, right? Because yes, eventually you will start being able to just cut people out of the loop. Like instead of needing a 5-person team for research, you probably need a 1-person team for research. So that's just cost cutting. But if you're a company that's focused on growth, then all of a sudden, like think about what you can do with those 5 people plus AI. It's just much, much bigger. I'm not saying that AI is not going to be disruptive to jobs. I think it is. I mean, in terms of especially the things like call centers and just sheer research jobs and things like that. But here's the other thing: if you're just looking to cut out those people, then you're not looking at growth, right? Instead, to your point about like this isn't just about like doing the same thing quicker. It's like, well, what could we reimagine? I mean, that's why people are talking about like, well, are we going to have the first like one person, unicorn company? I don't know. That still feels very aggressive to me. But are we going to have the first 10-person unicorn company? Yeah, we're already getting that stuff. I mean, like with companies like Midjourney and I don't think Perplexity is that big a company. These companies are worth billions at this point. So, and why is that? It's because they have found ways of like taking individuals and really expanding what they're able to do. The organizations that I think work best with AI are the ones that are scared and frantic and holy cow. Like that's why I think this is why I always want nonprofits to use AI more. And I try to do a little bit with nonprofits because if you've ever been in the nonprofit world, you know that you're trying to do like 5 jobs at once because your resources are limited, right? Same with little startups, small startups. You know this world, Dan, right? Like, I mean, like you're talking about like everybody wears like 5 hats, right? Everybody has to be totally on board. Even OpenAI, when Sam Altman was kind of getting booted out, there were only like 700 people in OpenAI. But my God, like they all kind of came together. Why? Because they were like frantic. You have to have that kind of like frantic, like, no, we gotta, because if you're talking about really large organizations, like, and I won't name them because some of them are clients, but like big organizations, you're going to have 10,000 people that are just looking to come to work and then go home. And that's okay. But like, what if instead you could say to them, I'm not just going to help you cut out of your day all this dumb non-value add stuff that you hate doing. I'm also going to help you become, a better cook and gardener and parent and spouse and everything else. Like nobody takes Salesforce home and makes their life better. But this is going to make your work more interesting. It's going to make you better at your job. And that's going to be helpful to us too. So anyway, so to the point of like, how do you start changing mindsets on a grand scale? That's how you do it. You have to take a totally different approach.
So, part of this sort of frantic paranoia, almost like we have to keep up, it's a healthy motivator. But if you're in an organization like insurance, you mentioned that a few times, that tends to be a slower moving ship, so to speak. Like, how do you institute something like that as a leader? Like, how do you create a passion around innovation when, as a company and a culture, you haven't fostered innovation or haven't prioritized innovation? So, how do you balance that?
I think the only way to do it that I've found, and there's maybe other ways to do it, but I haven't found them yet, is you have to put it in the best interest of your people to use this stuff. And usually when we're talking about innovation, what are we talking about? We're definitely not talking about how do you make people's life better or more interesting or anything like that. You're talking about how do you drive innovation for the company? Do you know what I mean? Like, and which ultimately means how do you drive revenue for the company and the shareholders? And so you can incentivize your employees to do that through various means. Like, hey, if you use these new innovative tools, you'll probably be evaluated more highly, and that could lead to promotions. But that's very theoretical. I've worked in organizations, I'm sure you have too, and we all have, where it's like, better work and better quality it's not a one-to-one thing. You know what I mean? Like, well, I've done this more, unless you're in, trading or something like that, right? Like there's not a one-to-one thing of like, I've worked so much better and thus I get rewarded for it. That's not the world of corporate America. It's just not, right? So instead, what if, at home, or in your life or in your own work, you have found a tool that will make you happier and make you work better and all that kind of stuff, right? Why are students using ChatGPT all the time, right? It's a little bit of a rhetorical question, which you can answer, I can answer, and anybody with, kids can answer, which is, well, because it's in their best interest to cheat, right? I mean, like cheat and get away with it, right? I work in academia and I have kids. Like I'm under no false impressions here. Students are using ChatGPT all the time because they had to sort of sit at home and write a 10-page paper on Hamlet that now can be done in 25 minutes, right? So of course they are going to use that, right? It's same with, any tool that you can use to just make your own life better, people are going to use. Tools that people generally tend to not gravitate toward naturally are the ones that are going to make more money for somebody else. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that you need an approach which is going to tell your people, and you say it with sincerity, like, look, you know how there's like probably 3 hours of your day that you just hate? Like, you just hate it, right? I mean, like, it's this like, take doctors or something, or I work with big law firms a lot. Nobody got into big law for all the paperwork, right? They got into law because there's an excitement about working with people, making their lives better, like challenges, money, obviously, things like that, but just like that kind of stuff. And what if I said, well, guess what? You know how you have to do 3 hours of paperwork a day? That's going to be reduced to 30 minutes a day, right? And for the rest of your that 2.5 hours or 3.5 hours or whatever it is, you're going to be able to work on stuff that's actually fun to you. And not only that, but will actually probably be, good for your cause, like good for your team. And that will get reflected at the year-end bonus and all that kind of stuff. And also, this is also a tool that you get to take home. And again, like all of a sudden, that frustrating thing where you're trying to put together that IKEA furniture, this is going to help you do that every day. It's going to help you put together IKEA furniture better. Like people be like, sign me up. And it's going to like, Mother's Day cards, such a track. It's going to help you do that. And, oh, like cooking, like you want to be a better, it's going to help you do that. Like you're going to help you with it. Anyway, point being, you have to put this in the best interest of your people, not in a way that's like, this is going to make us better and working as a team, but actually, literally, how is it going to help you either make more money or help you accomplish or get rid of boring tasks or help you accomplish what you want, your own personal goals? That's it. Full stop. End of story. If you don't do that, if you don't teach them these frameworks, which will sort of like help get them from A to B in terms of how they're going to make their entire life better, I mean, good luck. Maybe some people will sign up and they'll have fun with it and they'll do it. But to really transform your organization, that's what you have to do.
Do you think there's a trust issue? So if you look at how corporations have behaved over the last, 3 years or so, layoffs, almost a regular drumbeat of those things. The narrative is AI is replacing me. So is there a fear or a mistrust because we don't know where it's going? And if I start operating in AI, almost like creating all of this output in partnership with AI, is there a fear that I'm making myself irrelevant? Like, is that a challenge?
I think it's huge. I think it's huge. And I think the way you stated is exactly right, which is, well, if I start using this and we bring this into our company, are we just replacing ourselves? Do you know what I mean? Like and that should be a real fear, right? It totally should be. Why should it be a real fear? Not because it's true or not true, but because that's an existential threat to you as being able to provide for, yourself or your family or something like that. Anything that threatens that, you should be terrified of. Why wouldn't you be terrified of it, right? I mean, it's why, in our country, sort of like rightfully or not, like there's a terrible fear of like, immigration or something like that, right? Why? Because, well, what if somebody comes in and is willing to do your job for less? So whatever you think, politically or anything like that, you can understand where that fear comes from. Right now, it's probably not accurate in the way that we think it's accurate, but the fear is understandable and it's our survival mechanism. So how do we address that fear, right? How do we kind of think about this in terms of trust? That's leadership. That's a leadership question. Like leadership has to help you understand what this is going to do and what it's not going to do. I will also say that, the statistics of how many people are using AI and how often, all that kind of stuff, I think are extremely skewed. And that's my own empirical research. I would call it anecdotal because I haven't done structured testing on it. But I will tell you that any room I go into, when I say, hey, who's used ChatGPT, most hands go up. But if I say, who's using it more than 5 times a day, all the hands go down. Who's paying for it? Who's $20 a month for it? 5% of the room, all that kind of stuff. So when we think about like everybody's using it, it's just not true. The analogy I use on this is like, who here in a room of 500 people uses Excel? Probably every hand will go up because somebody's, everybody in there at some point or another has made a shopping list or has made a personal budget or has just messed around with it and or made a list of, their daughter's volleyball team or something, right? But if I say, okay, who's using Excel 30 times a day and using over 16 formulas a day and using it to, you know what I mean? Like every hand goes down, right? Even me, I'm at a business school. And how often am I using it? Not that often. So there's a difference between like using it and air quotes here, using it, right? So a lot of people use ChatGPT for, every once in a while they're writing an email or something like that, but who's using it extensively? So the trust thing comes in because people sort of are using it on occasion and they're sensing, gosh, this thing is, probably very, very powerful. It's probably going to be able to do my job, et cetera, et cetera. And that's both true and not true. Meaning, like, we all got enamored in early 23 about this thing like writing poems, right? It was like, oh my gosh, it's amazing writing poems. Why is that? And Dan, I'm kind of workshopping this in real time, right? Because I only thought of this over the past weekend. But I was thinking, like, why was everybody like writing poems? We all writing poems because we were all crap at writing poetry, right? And so when ChatGPT did it in 2 seconds, we're like, this is amazing. This thing can do anything. However, my dad happens to be like a published poet, right? He's like a kind of a well-known poet, believe it or not. If he looked at this, he'd be like, oh, that's trash. That poem is absolute garbage, right? So how would he say this, and why does everybody disagree? Because he knows what good poetry looks like. So when we're worried about this thing taking our job, I want to kind of take people by the shoulders and say, I just have to tell you something here. You are a marketer. You're worried about this thing taking your job because you see everybody using it for marketers. Okay, so let me just do a little test with you here. I'm not a marketer. Put me against an actual professional marketer and say, you guys each have 20 minutes to use ChatGPT to create a new marketing campaign. After 20 minutes, me, Connor, the non-marketer, will come up with something extraordinary for a new shoe company. It'll be amazing. It'll have images and it'll have a whole, like all the copy. It'll be everything. And I'll hold this up and be like, look at this. And all the non-marketers will be like, oh my gosh, you're right. It's going to take the marketing jobs. But now let's look at the work done by professional marketer over there in 20 minutes. It will so far exceed me, it won't even be close. What's the difference? The difference is that the professional marketer knows what good quality looks like. The professional marketer knows what to tweak, where to guide it, all that kind of stuff, right? All of that, right? So they'll actually create something because it'll be expanding and augmenting their marketer brain, and they'll come up with something that's extraordinary. Whereas I have like the plastic ashtray as a 5-year-old I made for my parents. I'm like, look at this thing, right? But the professional marketer is like, no. Here's what good actually looks like. So I want to take that professional marketer and every professional in this country and say, what you have in your brain when you add this augmentation machine to it will be way better than anybody. Nothing will be able to take your job, because you with this is way better than anybody, like any 22-year-old coming into this thing with ChatGPT. So that's where the trusting has to come in. Sorry, that was a very long answer. But the trusting has to come in when people say, I understand the trusting, but you working with this thing, nobody will ever be able to catch you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's encouraging, it's exciting as far as perspective to say, if I can upskill and I can augment, even better, right? Because if anybody who's kind of used ChatGPT or any of the other LLMs with any frequency, you quickly see it's kind of gravitating toward like the most common answer, right? And as a marketer, you probably don't want the most common answer. You're trying to stand out, right? So you're saying, okay, how can I understand how I can use this insight plus technology to come up with something net new that has a unique insight? Like LLMs by nature aren't creating new insights. They might guide you to think about something that you were thinking about, but then that sparks 3 other things. And if you're a professional, you know what great looks like, the possibilities become interesting and exciting. But if you stop there, if you say, no, I'm just going to let ChatGPT build this for me, to your point, it becomes basic and everything starts to look and feel the same. And we've all seen even some of these image generators where you can tell, the output is somewhat homogenized and you're like, okay, outside of the occasional extra finger, you can also tell like, okay, I know this is AI because there's certain qualities to it that wouldn't be there if I had created it myself. So I think, that's a really healthy outlook to say, listen, capacity that I have as an individual just got raised significantly. If I can augment some of the 3 to 4 hours that was menial tasks that weren't advancing my life and weren't fulfilling in any way, what if those could be automated? And what do I fill that time with? And can I get better and faster and in higher skilled? So, I like that perspective. And I think people that kind of click that in their brain, fast forward 6, 12, 24 months from now, are going to be way better off as a professional than they would be otherwise. So I think that's really healthy. You mentioned kind of this train where 2023 was the year of like, shut it off, don't touch it. 24 was like light experimentation, but really, if you do that hand raiser moment, we see the same thing. people are still, operating reasonably cautiously and not really deploying it for all the reasons we talked about. What do you see in 25 if you were to predict, behavior change or not behavior change? Is it going to be more of the same, or do you see organizations opening the gates a little bit more?
Opening the gates for sure. Although I again, and this is kind of a hot take, but I think adoption is I hope I'm wildly wrong on this, but I think adoption will still be fairly slow and steady. I think we kept thinking there's going to be this moment where everybody's going to adopt to it because of something, right? Like name your thing. But I also think that people who listen to AI and love AI and all that kind of stuff live in a little bit of a bubble, right? So like we're all talking about like Google's Notebook LM, which as a lot of people probably know, it's this thing where you can put something in, it turns into an extremely realistic podcast sounding thing about that thing. It's been named like the product of the year and all that kind of stuff. You go out on the street, how many people have actually used or even know what Notebook LM is? Right. So in our world, it's this huge thing where like, oh my gosh, I could take this like really big fundamental thing and use it. There's all these things which feel like, oh, that's the thing that's going to get it over adoption. Like it's the voice or it's the vision or all that kind of stuff. I still think it's going to be a fairly slow and steady adoption. The technology is a hockey stick, but who cares? I mean, a lot of people of this do. I've like, I have a podcast too about like sort of like talking about this stuff, and I'm on LinkedIn talking about this stuff because it's interesting to hundreds of thousands of us. But in terms when you're talking about like, tens of millions, it's still very just like slow adoption. So I think adoption will still, kind of keep going at the steady rate. But I truly believe that this is a behavioral issue, and behavioral things don't change overnight. They just don't. And so I'd love to think that there's going to be a moment, but I just think it'll be slow and steady. I think the technology will outpace us dramatically, and I think people living on the outer edge of that will look like superhumans just because we're using technology that's available to everyone. But I think otherwise, I think the grand scale behavioral is going to be sort of like still a steady slope upwards.
To build up of that, you have using these LLMs natively in a lot of what we talked about has been that, and then you have building on top of LLMs, not unlike what we at Skyword have done. Like, can you take multiple LLMs, tag them in the right places to take original ideas and scale them in channels and audiences and things like that? When technology becomes invisible, like electricity almost, and embedded in, do you think that's an easier path to scale versus people going kind of direct to the source and start having everything almost just automatically included? And is that the tipping point versus everybody getting a chat GPT paid account?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, Google and Microsoft alone cover how many billions of people, right? And those products are now being built into both those products, right? Into Google Workspace and to Microsoft Office. So it exists, but a lot of it is just it feels like an additional feature onto your email or an additional feature onto PowerPoint or something like that. Like we haven't sort of structured that thing yet where it says like, because they'll say like, how can I help you? Or something like that. Like, Google Gemini or whatever the Microsoft tool is. It's GPT under the hood, but like there's a chat bot there saying, hey, how can I help? Like the old Clippy or something like that. But people don't really trust it yet, to your point about trust, because they've said like, well, I'm trying to build a PowerPoint and still the output is not good. And so people are like, well, I tried that, but it doesn't work until it works. And then you'll have to overcome like all the people who thought like who knew it didn't work back in the past. But until you can just say, hey, I'm trying to build a PowerPoint, and it's able to almost like read your mind and do it with such speed that it's actually building something. You mean this? No, this, no, this, or pick up the 4 things that you want and like, give me everything that you have. It's still a behavioral change. So yes, that is the path, I believe, for sure. But still there's this difference between the features on Word, PowerPoint, Excel, etc., and this other thing, which is this chatbot being like, hey, Connor, how can I help you? And that's a giant shift in your brain. And that's where it becomes just trickier. So I don't know how that's going to work. You're right. It's absolutely the path, but I don't think anybody's really cracked that code yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think for folks playing in that space, or even when you're looking at partners, part of it is like, hey, how are you a specialist in certain areas? And can you help us like transform how we think about sales outreach or HR or reimagining our legal documents? Like it's almost, if we're thinking of this as a software problem or a technology problem, we're missing the boat, if I hear you right. It's more like, we have to rewire our brains if we're going to, and if we're going to take advantage of this in a truly transformational way, as you described. Like, how do we have an organization that has superpowers, not individuals that have superpowers? Well, part of it is having the right tools, but the other is knowing what to do with them and how to change behavior, and almost think of it as a roadmap of like, what are the first 5 things we need to change as an organization? And then what happens after that? And what happens after that? And then as a leader, that becomes a playbook that right? Like, how do we transform an organization from X to Y or Z? And what does that path look like? I think part of the issue is that path has yet to be defined. So it takes a little bit of a understanding and a leap of faith, and kind of walking down that path, and with a brush blade to kind of clear the way. But I think once we figure that out, that's where we'll see some significant change. But totally agree with you. If you just hand anybody technology, it goes back to your treadmill analogy, which it'll be sitting in the corner with half of your laundry draped over the top of it, and we're not any leaner or fitter. So that's amazing. Anything, any other hot takes or things we didn't cover as we're thinking about 2025 and beyond?
No, I think that really covered it. I really like to focus on behavior. I think that people are talking a ton about 2025 as the year of, fill in the blank, like AI agents, or, moving past piloting into scaling, or robotics or something like that. And in the end, I just think 2025 is going to be like 2024, the year of, are people going to adopt or not? And we need, I think, frameworks and ways of thinking about that and all that kind of stuff. So I think that certainly the people who are using it are going to continue to stay ahead. People are not. I don't think they're going to be able to. I don't think that their individuals will not fall further and further behind, because there's, they can like leap ahead very quickly, but companies are at a greater risk. And so I just think people have to focus, to your point about like, who's going to like lead the way on this? Like, how are you going to sort of, get this information out of your head into other people's heads and things like that? And it's not just about like, well, do people know it or not? It's like, you have to understand systematically how you're going to bring this into your company. I think that is the hardest and biggest challenge, but that's where people are going to win.
Amazing. And for those listening, Conor's course, outstanding. Conor is an individual. Bring him in. He will change your life. But Conor, how can people find you or get in touch to you, or find your course?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm I'm fairly prolific on LinkedIn. I just kind of addicted to that site. So that's a very easy way to find me. Otherwise, like, you just kind of Google me or AI mindset or something like that. And thanks for asking. Yeah, I have like, a course and things like that. But also there's just a lot that we can do for free, just by sort of like all tracking each other on LinkedIn. But if you want sort of like a framework, I think we do need that. That's the best place to find me, either on LinkedIn or just at aimindset.ai.
Amazing. Any last thoughts before we wrap here?
No, this was great. My gosh, we covered a ton. I loved how you asked the question. So thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. And Conor, really, really strong episode. I think everyone appreciates your insights and your position. And if this hasn't been hammered in your head, follow Conor on LinkedIn. Take his course. You will thank me. And Conor, thanks again for the time.
Thanks, Dan. Great to see you.
Thank you for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyword. To stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing, visit our website at skyword.com. That's skyword.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling.